Dr. Kolk is a professor of psychiatry at Boston University School of Medicine, medical director of the Trauma Center at Justice Resource Institute, director of the National Center for Child Traumatic Stress. He served as president of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. He has authored well over 100 articles on psychological trauma. Among his many awards, he was granted the Distinguished Life Fellow from the American Psychiatric Association. His areas of expertise throughout trauma hit many areas, including those related to cognitions and dissociation. I am thrilled and delighted to introduce Dr. Bessel van der Kolk.
And I am, in turn, am thrilled and delighted to be here. I was actually surprised to be invited because my work on borderline personality disorder per se is about 20 years old. But then listening to this morning's presentation, I thought maybe it's not quite outdated. So my field is trauma. And that's how I got into borderline personality disorder. And this is how we got into it. It starts off with the issue of diagnosis. And diagnosis, and we'll end there also because the issue of diagnosis keep popping up as a complex issue. So the field of traumatic stress sort of started again for the third time in about 1978 when another group of large numbers of soldiers came back to home and were terribly messed up. And our way of looking at the world was through the Oedipal conflicts, and we couldn't quite fit in what these guys were suffering from through Oedipal conflicts. And so we lobbied the American Psychiatric Association, and veterans lobbied people for a traumatic stress diagnosis. Now, in order to get a diagnosis in, we had to convince the military and the VA that what these guys were suffering from, which is mainly explosive, aggressive reactions, and an inability to engage with their current life, actually was related to trauma. And so the hallmark of PTSD became the issue of memory. And people specifically remembering nightmares and flashbacks, because without those memories, we could not pin the trouble these guys were suffering from to their war experiences. And so the whole traumatic stress field got defined by people remembering what had happened to them and being haunted by that. In fact, as we heard so elegantly this morning, traumatized people oftentimes aren't actually remembering their trauma. As Freud said many, many years ago already, instead of remembering, they reenact it. And Freud says, and that is their way of remembering. And history has proven him right in that respect. So what is also interesting is that the moment that we had this diagnosis, our veterans started to have the diagnosis. Namely, once we have a system where certain things become acceptable to talk about and other things are not, our patients adjust themselves to us and start using the language that's familiar to us. So when it's listed in our little DSM, we say, oh yeah, that makes sense. And if it's not there, it doesn't make sense. For example, there are very interesting findings about visual perceptual abnormalities and spatial abnormalities that we heard about this morning is something that we see also in our very traumatized kids all the time, including in the videotape that I'll show you at the end. But those abnormalities happen not to be included in the DSM, and hence they are always surprising findings because they're not on the list. So it starts off very modestly, and it's interesting to think about how the DSM started. It started off with Robert Spitzer, and Robert Spitzer sort of admits that he was a bit on the what we call today the spectrum. He's a psychiatrist who didn't really understand people very well. A very good place to start being a psychiatrist, I think. And he said, you know, I don't understand all this stuff about psychoanalysis. I just know what I see. And people said, that's a good guy to start our diagnostic process. So he was put in charge of the DSM-3. And being a modest fellow, he said, I don't know much about people, so please tell me about what you find. So shortly after the diagnosis of PTSD was created, a number of us went to talk to Bob Spitzer and said, Bob, you know, we created this diagnosis for veterans for one-time trauma. But what we're discovering is that in our clinical world, we see a lot of very, very traumatized people all the time who are more victims of childhood abuse, molestation, and domestic violence. And they don't quite fit the diagnosis of PTSD as we have currently constructed. And he said, oh, is that so? You guys clearly are not stupid, so since you're clinicians, you see this, I will pay attention to that. That's very different from how our current diagnostic procedures go. And so the DSM-3 comes out, and at that time, the psychiatrists are very modest. And there's a paragraph in the DSM-3 that says, this is just a compilation of symptoms. This is just something that was created so we can talk to each other when we do treatment outcome studies, but it's too inaccurate to ever be used for forensic or insurance purposes. And somehow that little paragraph was left out of the DSM-4 and certainly will be left out of the DSM-5. So what our diagnoses are, they're conventions that help us to sort of more or less categorize what our patients suffer from. And that is subject to culture and evolving knowledge. As you probably have heard about, NIMH has just ditched the DSM-5. We'll get back into that. And so much of my work after working with the Vietnam veterans started with patients like this, this is the family portrait of one of my patients who was in a group with me as a young faculty member. And this happened to be a patient who turned out not to remember whether she was sexually abused herself or not. But again, it's somebody who could draw her picture of what had happened to her, but could not tell the story, even though she was living it all the time. And so when the issue of trauma came up in our ordinary psychiatric patients, we went to the textbooks. And this is the textbook from which I learned, which I that I read in order to take my board examination in psychiatry. And it's a very comforting textbook. It said, incest is very rare. It happens in 1 out of 1.1 million women. And I thought, that's interesting, because that means at that time there were about 200 million women, people in the States, about 100 million women, 110 women would be incest victims. How come 47 of those 110 women have ended up in my little office at my residency paying from? And not only does it never happen, but it is also very benign. So I'll read it. There's little agreement about the role of father-daughter incest as a source of serious subsequent psychopathology. The father-daughter liaison satisfies instinctual drives in the setting where mutual alliance with the omnipotent adult condones the transgression. The act offers an opportunity to test in reality infantile fantasies whose consequences are found to be gratifying and pleasurable. Such incestuous activity diminishes the subject chance of psychosis and allows for a better adjustment to the external world. The vast majority of them were none the worse for the experience. So that's what the textbooks read. And one of my very first patients after I finished my residency was the former, very old guy, former head of internal medicine at Mass General. He said, he called me Dr. Van der Kolk. I was very pleased by that. And he said, Dr. Van der Kolk, never believe anything you read between hardcovers, because between hardcovers, people can just say whatever they want to say. And science is about facts. And that was a useful thing to listen to. So the next thing that happens is that I meet Judy Herman. And Judy Herman has written the first book about incest for our generation. And I'm working with veterans and neurobiology. And we start talking to each other. And we say to each other, isn't it interesting how many of our patients who are labeled as borderline personality disorder have these horrendous trauma histories? And we wonder together whether borderline personality disorder might have any correlation with childhood trauma. So we went to NIMH, put in the proposal, and came back with, what a bunch of nonsense. Put a second proposal, what a bunch of nonsense. And then Chris Perry, who was the research director at the Cambridge Hospital at the time, was studying every single Cambridge Hospital admission. And we went to Chris, and we said, Chris, we'd like to interview all of your patients for their trauma histories, and you have all the other data on them, so we can see how childhood trauma correlates with all the other data that you have collected. And Chris says, you know, you guys are on a wild goose chase. You'll find nothing because, Bessel, you know what Kernberg says. Yeah, but that's not what we see in our clinical practice. So the next challenge we face is, how do we take a trauma history? Now that trauma has become popular, our patients are at risk to enter a mental health center and, without knowing anybody, be asked on their first visit, have you ever been raped? Have you ever been assaulted? Has anybody ever beaten you up as a kid? And the likelihood that anybody will give an honest answer to that is zilch, because almost all of us are, even if you know, and oftentimes people don't know, you would be too ashamed to say that to somebody who you cannot trust with this information, if you don't. So Judy and I spent a lot of time thinking about how we ask questions. And we started off with asking people, so where do you live? Who lives with you? Who does the cooking? Who does the dishes? Who does the groceries? Who do you talk to when you come home at night? When you need help, when you're sick, when you need your car fixed, who do you rely on? When you feel bereft and upset, who do you talk to? And those very simple questions gave a lot of interesting answers, including quite a few people saying, my dog, or my therapist. And that really was quite a poor indication of people's interpersonal connectedness and a sign of very profound emotional isolation. And so having people able to say those things about their current life, and then we said, how about when you were little? Who loved you when you were a little kid? Who was affectionate to you? Who saw that you were a very special little kid? Because every little kid is a very special little kid. And was there anyone in your family who you felt safe with growing up? That was the killer question. And nobody ever asked that. Later on, I did a study on self-mutilation in adolescence, and I lost half of my sample asking my self-mutilating adolescents, was there anybody you felt safe with growing up? And they became so triggered and so upset that they left the room and left the study. So we heard a lot of stories at this point. And then we asked a bunch of other questions. We asked about who made the rules and enforced the discipline at home. What were the family rules like? How did the kids get disciplined? How did your parents solve their disagreements? And we got a lot of interesting stories out of that. We knew nothing else about our patients. And then Judy and I would sit together and we'd rate our forms, nice little rating forms, put it into the Harvard mainstream computer, give it to Chris Perry, and one day Chris Perry called us up on a Sunday morning and said, I got access to the gigantic Harvard mainstream computer. I got a minute and a half to analyze our data, and on top of the data analysis was that particular cartoon. Matthew's be getting another one of those habla español sounds, but basically our research shows that you really cannot understand the majority of people who are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder unless you understand the terror that they're coping with. And the terror had shown up in our interviews. Not all of them. So what did we find in our study is that 87% of our patients with borderline personality disorder had histories of very severe childhood abuse and or neglect. But not just that. It started prior to age 7. That's important because our brains get formed in a use-dependent way. And if you learn to grow up with terror and fear and distrust, that organizes your brain. The other personality disorders were not predicted by early childhood trauma. But there is that 13% who does not have childhood trauma. And certainly being in the Harvard psychology department at that point with Jerry Kagan, who was studying emotionally vulnerable children, we certainly had plenty of understanding that there's ways in which some kids see the world as a terrifying place, like we heard about this morning, and who interprets things that for other people are ordinary minor stresses in a way that it becomes traumatic. At the end, it's the interpretation of the particular organism that defines it. So aside from the issue of diagnosis, what I in particular was also interested in is this phenomenon that Dr. Sawyer was talking about this morning, but both people talked about this morning, and that's the issue of self-mutilation and self-harm. And I've always been fascinated by self-harm, that when most of us have a tough day in the office, we go and play a game of tennis, or we have a stiff gin and tonic, and most of us don't get comfort out of taking a razor blade and carving ourselves up. And so I've done quite a lot of studies, which I won't get into many details about, is what changes in the brain that makes doing terrible things to yourself a gratifying and comforting thing. And as luck would have it, we had data on all these things on our Cambridge Hospital population, which is a very typical population, probably very similar to what you see here at Yale. And so we looked at what predicted repeated suicide attempts and what predicted repeated cutting and anorexia. And we found that childhood sexual abuse was a major predictor of these repeated suicide attempts, as was to a lesser degree childhood physical abuse, of self-cutting, childhood sexual abuse, anorexia less so, binging really not in a significant way. And so childhood terror is a great predictor of all of these self-hurting behaviors. And then the question became, so what good does treatment do? And having prospective data on these patients, we followed them up for 3 years. And we looked at who were the people who got better and stopped doing that, and who were the people who continued to cut themselves and make suicide attempts. And there a different dimension came in. And what came out at that point was childhood separations and childhood neglect as being the big predictors of continued self-destructive behaviors. And so the conclusion we draw from that is that the people who were able to remember and identify somebody as a kid who they felt safe with growing up, who they felt held special by, when they would go into a psychotherapy relationship, they were primed to feel special and to feel looked at. And so they benefited from psychotherapy. But the people with profound histories of neglect were unable to benefit and reset their self-soothing systems, and they continued to hurt themselves afterwards. And so that was one of the first times that what started to emerge is this very complex interweaving of childhood trauma, which really is the critical issue in PTSD, and the whole issue of the attachment system and the security or the perceived security of the attachment system. And before you see me as a trauma fanatic, one of my kids was very much like the kid that the last parent was talking about this morning here also. So I know from first-hand experience that some kids perceive the world as very dangerous and very frightening, and may interpret certain things as traumatic that not necessarily are. But the issue that has not become central, and is very important also in all of you DBT people, because Marshall Linehan and I and other people have had discussions about it, is that in her own history that she talks about quite extensively, she doesn't talk about trauma, but she talks about very profound neglect of having led to her discovering and evolving DBT. So this is issue of trauma, of memories about specific terrifying events, and there's this other issue of not feeling safe, not feeling secure, and not really being able to fit in and to get the sort of comfort from interpersonal relationships because that went awry when you were young. I'm going to skip these. I hope that all of you know the ACE study, Vincent Filletti's study, which is one of the most important studies ever done in American medicine and psychiatry. It's done by internists, actually. And they figured out that, let me just give you the basic data. This is at the end, a database on 53,000 insurance-carrying, largely white people seen in Kaiser Permanente, who has this normal population. 1 out of 10 people said they were emotionally abused. 1 out of 4 people say that they were beaten up by 1 or more parents. 1 out of 5 people say they were sexually abused. 1 out of 4 people say there was substance abuse or alcoholism in the family. 1 out of 4 people were exposed to mental illness, and 1 out of 8 people were exposed to family violence. So trauma is ubiquitous in our society, and as Filetti and Anda in the A study show, are major predictors of smoking, obesity, depression, chronic suicidality, alcoholism, drug taking, unprotected sex, hepatitis, chronic arthritis, heart disease, and cancer. So the issue of insecure, frightening, and terrifying childhood has very deep and profound effects on every area of functioning. So those were the data that we started the DSM-4 with. And so we went to the APA, this time not with PTSD, but with the issue of, so what happens to people who have been chronically exposed to terrible events? And we got a small grant from the DSM, from the APA, for the field trial for the DSM-4. And we had 3 samples, 5 sites around the country, and we had a sample of people who had early onset abuse by their parents, late onset domestic violence, and a group of people who were exposed to a recent disaster. These are the people who usually get studied in PTSD studies. But these are the people who we actually see largely in our clinics. These are people who have a very different syndrome picture. And their main problems are affect dysregulation, chronic anger, chronic self-destructive behaviors, chronic suicidality, inability to modulate sexual involvement, amnesias, dissociation, feeling permanently damaged, feeling deeply ashamed of yourself, feeling alienated and nobody can understand me, all the stuff that we heard about this morning. And those things, by and large, do not occur in your regular PTSD sample, and they occur in the intermediate level in your people who currently are in domestic violence situations. The other important thing that we won't go into now is the whole issue of somatization and how the body keeps a score. This is a somatic experience. You become a terrified organism, and your immune system changes, your stress hormone system changes, and your perception of your body changes. I don't have time to go into all of the details right now, but you'll see some of that at the very end. And then a colleague of mine, Marilyn Clotre, did a very interesting study. She took a group of sexually abused adolescent girls and looked at their PTSD symptoms, and they looked at the complex PTSD symptoms, the affect dysregulation, anger, somatization, and interpersonal trouble group. And then she did child attachment interviews, very main interviews that I hope all of you have been trained in, because they're very, very helpful interviews to see what people's experience was of their childhood. And what Marilyn finds is that pure PTSD symptoms are a function of specific traumatic incidents. But that the other symptoms that we identify in this population, affect dysregulation, mood regulation, anger expression, chronic suicidality, self-injury, disturbance in relationship to self and others, is a function of disturbed attachment relationships. In our field, we have done quite a bit to help people with their traumatic memories. People do prolonged exposure, EMDR, various CBT treatments, but we really are not very good in dealing with attachment difficulties. There's very little treatment has been involved in it, and certainly are programs that involve theater programs for kids, and yoga programs for kids, and martial arts programs for kids to get them interpersonally attuned, are not sort of standard psychiatric treatments, even though we do research on it and we publish it on it from time to time. So the next study that Marilyn did that's also important is this one. She did, again, a study of sexually abused adolescent girls, and after the study was over, she was convinced that what made all the difference was that these kids had felt comfortable with the staff, that they loved coming to be seen and to get their treatment, but that the interpersonal relatedness was the critical issue. So, being a researcher, she made a measure for the warmth of the relationship and its effect on outcome in PTSD, and she found out that the warmth of the relationship had no significant relationship to the outcome of the PTSD. And it's very counterintuitive and odd, but certainly provokes curiosity. And so she thought, what else might be going into that predicts whether people get better or not? And what turns out is that the critical factor that determines whether people get better is the capacity for affect regulation. And if this therapeutic relationship leads to affect regulation, then people overcome their PTSD. And I think that's probably also true in your borderline personality groups, that if they learn to regulate their affect, they will start being in control over their lives. So the issue of affect regulation has become sort of the central quest of my particular research group. So we're still thinking about trauma and its impact on psychiatric problems. And in 1998, I get a phone call from the Cummings Foundation that says, Dr. van der Kolk, we know about your work. Would you be interested in doing a study on the effect of trauma on learning? And I said, well, nobody ever called me with such a generous offer, thank you. But, you know, there is a lot of work that's done already on the effect of trauma on learning. And, you know, the problem is not that we don't know that, although we certainly can know more. The problem is with the issue of dissemination, that somehow the whole issue of childhood trauma is not on the map. An example of that in reality, for example, right now, is that, of course, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of veterans are coming back. They are terribly traumatized, and there's a lot of research and treatment programs for returning veterans. Not enough, people always say, and possibly not enough. But what was said is that the funding that now goes to the veterans came out of the funding for child trauma programs. That's sort of the last area of priority. And given the data, there's probably about 30 times as many traumatized kids in our society than there are traumatized soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. So that's the big forgotten population. And so the Cummings Foundation are talking about it, that this is the population that nobody talks about, and that's the population that clogs up our prisons, our mental health systems, and all these school failures. So we talk about how can we actually create something, some entity, to bring this issue to the fore. And we decided to have a meeting, a 3-day workshop. And some of the people who attend are here from the Yale Child Trauma Study Center, people from Ted Kennedy's office, Harkin's office at the Senate, Donna Shalala from the Health and Human Services, the Justice Department. And we meet for 3 days with a whole bunch of people talking about the issue of childhood trauma and its effect on society and how we can address that. And what comes out of it is a proposal to create a national center for child traumatic stress studies. So to create a discipline of studying childhood trauma. And Congress funds that to the tune of $40 million. And now we have about 80 sites around the country where we're collecting data about traumatized kids. Yale is one of them. Over here, plugged up somewhere, we are one of them. So they're all over the place. And we're all talking to each other and collecting data and developing treatment programs. And as we do that, the treatment that sort of emerges is a treatment that is CBT, but you'll hear about in a little while, which is a terrific treatment for simple trauma, for one-time trauma. But we think that is not the kids we see. The kids who we see in the network are very complex kids. So we do a survey of 40,000 kids in the network and see what these kids look like. And it turns out that even though these kids right now are adolescents, when we take their histories, they have had multiple traumas over their lifetime, starting around age 5 on the average. So they only come to our attention as adolescents, and that 82% of these kids have multiple traumatic exposures, and also that the majority of them do not meet criteria for PTSD. So then we start looking at what do these kids look like and what do they get exposed to. And here what we find is that these traumatized kids who are being seen all around the country, the majority of the problems are not in terms of specific traumas, but in the attachment relationship. And so childhood emotional abuse is the most common trauma, the loss of a primary caregiver, having an impaired caregiver, and being exposed to domestic violence. What is interesting is that in the field trials for the current DSM-5, there were also questions about domestic issues and childhood trauma. The questions were two. One was, can we assume that life was pretty good growing up? That's all. The other one was anybody in your family a drug addict or an alcoholic? Those are all the questions that are being asked about one's early environment. Clearly, our field would like to ignore social realities and study genes and study core biological functions, because for us to actually find out how the environment shapes the brain would get us into very difficult situations. So those are things that are easier to ignore. And that's why I love this conference so much, that we got to hear from at least two people who actually talk about what it is really like. So childhood sexual abuse comes somewhere down the line. And neglect comes back, and childhood physical abuse. So it's about living in an environment that is dangerous. And so what are the consequences of that? Big thing that comes up, affect dysregulation. Being too angry, too upset, too nervous, too anxious, not being able to engage. The second thing is an inability to concentrate and to pay attention. Now, we talked this morning about the danger of diagnosis and misdiagnosing. And of course, our diagnoses are very flawed instruments, but if you take a very abused and frightened kid and you call this kid bipolar, you'll give this kid most likely risperidone or Seroquel. Last year, $18.1 billion profit to the drug industry. Not profit, they actually paid some money for the drugs also. And of course, the downside of that is that all these drugs work on the dopamine system in the brain. The dopamine system in the brain is the reward system of the brain. It's the part of the brain that makes you feel pleasure and engagement. And indeed, you can give antipsychotic drugs to kids and they will behave themselves better, but the likelihood that they will joyfully, enthusiastically engage in anything goes way down, because these drugs clearly interfere with that. And so having hundreds of thousands of kids on antipsychotic medications that interfere with school performance and engagement with their peers sets up a very bad stage for these kids ever becoming productive members of society. And that's why the issue of correct diagnosis and correct treatment actually is incredibly important, because all these things are not only translated into individual suffering, but gigantic public health issues that the society at large pays for in terms of unproductive and out-of-control people. And so what comes up in our survey of all of these traumatized kids is not the issue of memory, but the issue of attention, concentration, and affect regulation. And so as the DSM-5 rolls along, we get together with a group of us. This is the list. You may know some of them. all serious clinicians and researchers. And we proposed to the American Psychiatric Association a new diagnosis called developmental trauma disorder. And shortly after we formulate that, I give a talk in Washington, D.C. to the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors. And they love our proposal. And they write a letter to the APA saying, hey, you really should listen to us because we present every single state and territory in the United States. Our budget is $29.5 billion that we don't know how to spend fast enough. And we're treating 6.1 million people every year. And so please listen to us because this issue of developmental trauma is totally ignored, and we urge the APA to make this their priority issue. And after I get a support letter, I think, great, the work is done. I can go back to developing interesting treatments and stuff like that. Didn't quite work out that way. So this is what we said. The goal of introducing the diagnosis of developmental trauma disorder is to capture the reality of the clinical presentations of children and adolescents exposed to chronic interpersonal trauma and thereby guide clinicians to develop and utilize effective interventions and for researchers to study the neurobiology and transmission of chronic interpersonal violence. Children who have developed in the context of ongoing danger, maltreatment, and inadequate caregiving systems are ill-served by the current diagnostic system, as it frequently leads to no diagnosis, multiple unrelated diagnoses, an emphasis on behavioral control without recognition of interpersonal trauma, and lack of safety in the etiology of the symptoms, and a lack of attention to ameliorating the developmental disruptions that underlie the symptoms. So, this is what the diagnosis looks like. The child or adolescent has experienced or witnessed multiple or prolonged adverse events that include significant disruption in protective caregiving as a result of repeated changes in primary caregiver, like people going to jail, people going off to war, people splitting, repeated separation of the primary caregiver, and exposure to severe and persistent emotional abuse. So 3 issues. Affect regulation. An inability to tolerate, recover from extreme affect states, fear, anger, or shame, including prolonged and severe temper tantrums or immobilization. Disturbance in regulation of bodily functions, persistent disturbance of sleeping, eating, and elimination, overreactivity or underreactivity to touch and sound, disorganization during routine transitions, diminished awareness or dissociation of sensations, emotions, and bodily states. That's what we see. Attentional and behavioral dysregulation, a preoccupation with threat or ignoring threats, an impaired capacity for self-protection, maladaptive attempts at self-soothing, habitual, intentional, automatic, reactive self-harm, and an inability to initiate or sustain goal-directed behavior. Effects on the self. The word self is not really popular in diagnostic circles, but self is, of course, at the end what it's all about. So it's an intense preoccupation with safety of your caregivers, of yourself, not being able to tolerate being with people, intense negative sense of oneself, including self-loathing, helplessness, worthlessness, ineffectiveness, defectiveness, extreme and persistent distrust, reactive physical or verbal aggression, inappropriately attempts to get intimate contact with people, and an impaired capacity to regulate empathic arousal. And so this is what we collect on the basis of these 20,000 kids who we study directly by direct observation. And so we make this proposal to the APA, and then the response comes back as follows. The consensus was there was just too little evidence at this point to include DTD in the DSM-5. There have not been any published accounts about children with this disorder. No, because the disorder is not in the textbook. There have been no predictive validity tests. And there have been no studies or differential responses to treatments. In short, a number of reviewers felt that your proposal read more like a concept paper rather than as a scientific new syndrome. That was not good. So here, the notion that childhood adverse experiences lead to substantive developmental disruption is more clinical intuition than a research-based fact. We submitted research data on 200,000 children from around the world to substantiate our diagnosis. The statement is commonly made but cannot be backed by prospective studies. Actually, they can. And so this is a study by my colleague Carlos Ruth at the Cambridge Hospital of single mothers who are raising their kids in isolation. And after 2 years of, at 2 years old, she goes in their homes. And these kids all have serious behavioral problems, most of all of the aggressive kind. Then she sends a group of people into these mothers' homes to do something like CBIT, parent-child interaction therapy, to help these mothers to be more attuned to their kids. And after 6 months, these kids have much fewer behavioral problems. And after another year, they're almost the same as the community control group. Then the study gets closed down. The society is a way of closing these studies down. And for about 14 years, the study lies fallow until the priest abuse scandal in Boston, one of our proud achievements, brings the issue of childhood trauma and the reality back to the fore after years and years of fighting the issue of these people suffer from false memory syndromes, which again got played out around the issue of the pedophile scandals with the church also. And then suddenly people saw the reality of the childhood trauma again, some money became available, and Carolyn Lyons Ruth picks up her samples, she finds them, tracks them over time, and sees who of these kids are now in the mental health system. And what she finds is that what predicts these kids being currently in the mental health system is what she saw in the lab in terms of her videotaped interviews with the mothers and the infants, lack of verbal engagement at home, emotional or physical withdrawal at home, and disrupted maternal communication in the laboratory. So that's just one study of a member of our group. The other member of our group is Frank Putnam, who used to be at NIMH, who did a prospective study of sexually abused girls in the District of Columbia with a control group. He follows them up every 4 years and measures them every 4 years on every conceivable academic, psychological, biological, immunological test. And after the third time, he finds that the sexually abused girls have a decrease in social competence, academic performance, more school avoidance, etc., and major problems in biological regulation. That just goes on and on and on. So there's a lot of data on that. Why am I bringing this up? See, I think the issue is, why do people have such a hard time acknowledging the reality of childhood trauma? And it starts off with the last talk that we heard before lunch, is that psychiatry, when I trained, was a profession where people felt quite helpless in the face of major mental illness. And so the job of psychiatrists was find out who was responsible for people being so messed up. And basically the way I was trained in many ways was in parent blaming. And for example, as a medical student, I worked for Bruno Bettelheim in the autogenic school in Chicago, where autism was always blamed on refrigerator mothers and terrible mothers. And so at some point, parents get together and they say, we are sick and tired of being blamed. And they start an organization called NAMI, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, and they say, no, I want psychiatrists to actually learn to treat people and make reasonable diagnoses, a very good basic thing. With that, there was this big swing away from the environment and into biology, and we continue to struggle with that. It has its advantages, but by not knowing the reality of trauma, we ignore the issue of core safety and the fact that people cannot resolve their traumatic issues until they actually revisit the things that have hurt them so much. Anybody who does trauma treatment knows that you need to revisit a traumatized part of yourself and re-regulate it. So here's an example of what would happen if the field of borderline personality disorder and the field of traumatic stress would actually start listening to each other. Here's one example of findings. Here's a finding of a friend, a colleague of mine in Australia, Alexander McFarlane, of a number of 38 normal Australians who hear a particular sound, like eh. And their brains light up, the left brain lights up, the right brain doesn't light up, and they have a certain configuration of electrical patterns in their brain, which I'll tell you about in a second. Here are a bunch of traumatized people. Traumatized people hear a non-traumatic sound, like eh. Their left brain, the analytical, verbal, cognitive part of their brain, isn't really working at all, and their right brain tries to analyze what's going on. It's interesting that in our field, cognitive treatment has become so prominent for traumatized people, which makes a lot of sense for people who are not traumatized. But if you have learned anything about trauma, trauma wipes out your cognition. And so you need to do something else before people are able to do something cognitive, and I hope to show you an example of that. So this fits in very well with what Dr. Sawyer describes about herself when she was young. So here's a group of people listening to a stimulus, and what you see is they pick up electrical activity underneath in their brain, and what you see is that every part of the brain works together with every other part of the brain to figure out what means. And the first thing it does, it creates an N200. It's an inhibitory wave that tells your brain, don't pay attention to the butt against your chair or any noises or people coughing or something else. Pay attention to until you analyze what it is. So we focus our brain through inhibition. And then we focus our attention with a brain wave called the P300. The P300 is the wave in which you grab information. And so you concentrate, your capacity to concentrate is captured by your capacity to generate that particular brainwave. Here you have a bunch of traumatized people. The different parts of their brain aren't really working together. They don't create an inhibitory wave. They have a hard time creating a P300. And so what you see is that when they're presented with an ordinary day-to-day stimulus, they're not there. They can't really pick it up. And so what we see as the primary pathology of traumatized people, it's not the past. It's the inability to focus their brain to be in the present and to organize perceptual and sensory stimuli in a way that's relevant to the here and now. And so we get intrigued with that. And I don't have to write it. Wow. I was hoping to try to get this for a second. I want to show you a few little... Okay. So I go to conferences like this, like you do, and I hear people talk about something called neurofeedback. And I ask them, so what's neurofeedback? Say, well, actually, you can hook your brain up to a computer, and what you find is that these traumatized people have very abnormal brainwave patterns that makes it hard for them to analyze things, and then you can teach people to play computer games with their own brainwaves and reset their own brainwaves. And I think, that sounds intriguing. Good luck to you. And then somebody who I'd become friends with shows me a piece of research. And she says, there's a kid who was 7 years old. Wait a second. You're not seeing what I'm seeing. That is not good. There it is. This is a family drawing of an 8-year-old kid. It's a terrible family drawing. And after 20 sessions of neurofeedback, it's about 10 weeks, the kid makes that family picture. And I go, wow, that's really dramatic. I don't know any treatment that we have that can cause that degree of perceptual change. And that's another 20 weeks. So this is a new technique with which you can reconfigure the brainwaves of people. So we get into brainwaves, and we get into playing computer games, and we get into helping people to change their traumatic stress patterns with neurofeedback. And I would like to end up with 2 movies to just illustrate to you what that looks like. I just wanted to show you that, to give you a sense that if you break out of your sort of the diagnostic constraints and break out of what passes for evidence-based treatment and really explore and open up your thinking and your working and really integrate what we know about neurobiology, know about neuroscience, know about attachment literature, hear from survivors, there is hope for people. We should always be exploring new things. And over the years, I hope to show you more of what our various programs are able to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. van der Kolk. We have questions coming in, and people are welcome to jot down more. If you need green cards, raise your hand, and the volunteers can send them over to you. The first question is, how is dissociation different from depersonalization, and what are coping strategies for dealing with them? Start with the first. How are they different?
Well, it's all part of the same thing. What we see neurobiologically is that whole anterior cingulate medial prefrontal cortex gets thrown off. The posterior. Let me show you a slide. What dissociation looks like in the brain. For me, it's a very pretty picture. It's not a particularly pretty picture if you suffer from it. Yeah, somewhere in here. So, yeah. So, if you put people in the scanner, most of us, and you just lie there, and you don't have anything to do, you basically think about yourself and you experience yourself. So, you're just left with yourself, and that's called the default state network of the brain. The structures involved in that are orbital prefrontal cortex, medial prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate. That's the part of you that lets you experience yourself and know yourself. In the back, you have your parietal cortex that allows you to feel sensation in your body, the insula that tells your brain the state of your body, the posterior cingulate that tells you where your body is. So that's the normal self-registration of the brain. So here comes a scan of 18 people who are in a dissociative state chronically. That's what their brain looks like. All the structures of the brain involved with self are knocked out. Knowing yourself, articulating yourself, identifying yourself, saying what you feel, your insula, which tells you what your body needs, what your body wants, knocked out. Your parietal cortex, largely knocked out, a little bit of posterior cingulate left that allows you to move from one room to the next. So this is a brain that's dissociated out of it. And when you see that in the brain, the idea that you do cognitive treatment with this is ludicrous. This has to do with a body that doesn't know itself. So body doesn't experience itself. So how do you deal with that? We have a very active yoga program where people get to feel their body and experience their body. We have people who do cranial sacral therapy with people so that they know where their head is and know where their toes are. And you start in the basement with core sensory experience, and the sensory experience of being safe to feel your most elementary physical sensations. So you start in the basement of the brain, and that doesn't have to do with knowing, talking, analyzing, figuring things out. It has to do with just learning to experience yourself for the way you are. So you can help that with neurofeedback. You can help that by increasing heart rate variability training. You should get little M-wave machines for all your patients, or download an app for you here called GPS for Soul, I think it's called. It's a very nice way of teaching people to regulate their brainstem arousal level, stuff like that. Yeah, next question.
There's a question about why is it that trauma survivors' sense of time is distorted? And then there's follow-up questions to that with regard to how it affects their functioning and interventions.
Well, it's true that sense of time is affected. And I walked in here this morning with a little slide that showed defective dorsolateral prefrontal cortices, a borderline personality disorder. On brain scans, we can't tell the two of them apart. They look the same. And if you do the brains of traumatized people, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is off. And when your sense of time disappears, it's a very important thing in terms of this current craze for exposure treatment. When you become hyper-aroused and you lose your sense of time and you start reliving your trauma, it is as if you're right now getting traumatized. And so exposure treatment while people are losing their sense of time, in my notion, that's malpractice, actually, because you traumatize people by exposing that, and the only time you should do exposure treatment is if people are firmly rooted in being here and have a very firm sense of time, i.e. when the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate and the thalamus is online, because you need all those structures to process those experiences.
And do you have interventions to suggest for individuals who struggle with this distorted sense of time?
Yeah, but I think what I just showed, neurofeedback, is very good with that. Okay. Yoga is not bad. Yoga does give people a sense of time and place. But
there's a question about someone's referring to data showing that habituation may not occur with BPD, and whether revisiting trauma makes sense for people with BPD.
See, I think visiting trauma is... I thought that Dr. Sawyer's talk was just lovely, huh? Because it starts off with feeling safe with people, getting a sense of self, getting a sense of orientation, getting a sense of competency. Visiting trauma is important to the degree that particular things keep coming back, as Freud said back in 1893, like these foreign objects that are sitting in the mind that keep sort of popping out. And so, yes, it's useful to go there, but you need to know what the traumatic memories are. So you need to be very specific about particular images, particular notions, particular senses of what's happening. So this is not sort of global talk therapy. It's really visiting the scene of whatever is bothering people.
There's a question about mindfulness practice, and the question is, how does mindfulness practice reestablish normative brain functioning? So perhaps first, do you believe it does?
Well,
and if so, how does it?
Come to our conference, the 24th Boston Annual Trauma Conference, a worthy sister conference to this one, because I love your conference also, is largely about it. It's about attachment and mindfulness. And I did a little webcast the other day. My interviewer said, I said, of course, mindfulness is the foundation of everything. And she said, no. I said, no, actually, you cannot have a mind without being mindful. Like, it's so obvious. And so the issue of becoming a mindful person who knows oneself is the sine qua non of all therapy. The trouble is that the structures of mindfulness are knocked out by trauma. And so learning how to become mindful for traumatized people is extraordinarily difficult. And I would suggest that you get some neurofeedback going into your people who can't do mindfulness to get their mind to become, them to know that they have a mind. Because it's so hard to feel yourself and notice yourself, because exactly those brain structures that allow you to be mindful are really not online in the most traumatized people. But you can't get better until you have a mind.
Do you believe, the question is your sense that the 87% figure regarding neglect abuse reflects a typical history of borderline, or something about that specific sample? There's a question about whether that would be whether that 87% would be found in individuals who come from a normal family. I'm a little confused by the question, but the question is do you think that's a representative 87%?
Yeah. I'll give you the answer to that. So just put it in there. Our figure of 87% is nothing strange about it. In fact, here it is. This was one of the comments from our esteemed colleagues. Worrisome, perhaps, is that of all the 9 symptoms of borderline personality disorder, all are clearly represented in the proposed DTD symptoms. And I made up a little list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 articles, and all the articles I could fit in on my slide that have shown similar figures of about 87%. So from time to time, some unfortunate person gets me to review an article for the American Journal of Psychiatry that says it has been hypothesized that borderline personality is correlated with childhood trauma. No, at some point the hypothesis becomes a correlation. And after you have 15 papers by 15 independent researchers establish it, it's a fact. It's no longer a hypothesis.
Can you speak to childhood medical trauma? Are approaches to trauma in the peds medical arena changing?
Yeah, those are two different questions. I think pediatrics has been vastly more responsive to what we've learned about attachment, actually, than psychiatry has been. Like, if psychiatry really knew the attachment literature, we would not treat kids out of context of their family, because we are part of our family. And you would not send kids back to environments that might be not good for them. And you would treat the whole system. Pediatrics has been good at that. When I was an 11-year-old kid, I had a tonsillectomy. My parents weren't allowed to come more than an hour a day. My siblings weren't allowed to come. I loved my siblings. Parents were complicated. And that doesn't happen anymore. Right now, in pediatrics, parents are allowed to come all the time, and they get it. You need your mother. And your trauma depends to a large degree on the physiological arousal of your parents. And if your parents are quiet and safe and calm, you take your cues from your caregiving system. Psychiatry hasn't learned it yet. Does medical trauma mess kids up? Yes, major way. I've seen DID after medical procedures in kids, terrible traumas, like in kids who have facial surgery, waking up in the morning, not recognizing who that person is in the mirror, not knowing who they are. Terrible. So, yeah.
There are a few questions about the neurofeedback work that you presented. One is, what is the status of research on the efficacy? Are there efficacy studies at this point? Or effectiveness,
here
perhaps?
And there are studies. We completed our first study that's being reviewed right now. We're in the middle of our second study. Actually, what's interesting to me, it has to do with paradigm issues. We're always dealing with paradigms. Now, I know the PTSD literature fairly well, as you can imagine. As far as I know, aside from our EMDR study, which had fantastically good results, the best study for the most complex PTSD sample I've seen was a neurofeedback study by a guy by the name of Peniston and Kolk, published in 1989 and 1991. And it's very interesting that this has not continued. If this had been drug studies and somebody could have been able to make money out of it, the whole world would be doing it. But it's not an economically particularly lucrative field.
And there's a question about, can you comment to the frequency of sessions and the duration of sessions with neurofeedback?
Oh, neurofeedback, I like to do it about twice a week. In our studies, we do it twice a week. And we see substantial improvements after 20 sessions, tapering off over time. So the gain is made in the first 20 sessions, and then we see some continued improvement after that.
Are there implications or ways to use neurofeedback for clinicians who don't have the technology, who don't have that program?
There are people who do it. It's a very wild field. You know, it's another, people, this for computer nerds, which I am actually not. I got this neurofeedback because I see a lot of people like Carolyn, and I couldn't get them better. So that's sort of part of my Hippocratic oath. But so since I got into neurofeedback, I get to see a lot of computer people who don't understand a lot about psychology and the complexities of stuff that we are talking about. So it's a very wild field. But I suggest that if you have a treatment setting, that you take 1 or 2 people of your staff and get trained. There's 5 different instruments. It's a very complex field, actually. Yep.
We have a couple of EMDR questions. One is, can you say a few words about EMDR as it relates to borderline personality disorder?
My take on EMDR, based on both my clinical practice and the NIMH funding from the study we did in EMDR, is that EMDR is a fantastic treatment for single incidence trauma. Like we had this marathon bombing in Boston, as you know. The person who sort of ran the day-to-day operations of our EMDR project says, these people come in and I can tell them, 4 sessions, you'll be out of it, it will be over. And we can really say that with great confidence. I can also say it to my patients. In terms of chronic people who have chronic adaptations to trauma, or for whom trauma is just part of the overall picture, EMDR is a helpful tool, but it's just a nice thing to know about. But it certainly won't cure borderline personality disorder. It's a tool that helps people neutralize particular memories. So when people get really upset thinking about how their dad used to beat them, or they get really upset when they make love to somebody and they get triggered and start feeling like they're little again. Being able to go back to that scene of the molestation and processing it with the EMDR is very helpful. But it's just a small tool out of a very large toolbox with those people.
And I think that just spoke to the second question. One final question before our break is, do you have, what are some of the most promising non-traditional interventions in response to early childhood attachment disorder? Are there non-traditional interventions that you care to comment on?
It depends on what tradition you follow, of course. What we are exploring with gusto, but we got the worst NIMH review on our grant application for that one, is sensory integration. And I'll just finish with that story, it's very interesting. We saw a number of kids coming from China and Russia out of orphanages, terribly attachment disordered kids, some trauma, but the real issue is that the brain circuits for attachments were not really activated. And we did all kinds of psychotherapy stuff with them. It didn't work. And then we know some occupational therapists who do sensory integration therapy for kids with sensory integration stuff. And they got our kids to move and to talk and for their brains to become functioning to some degree. And so we now have a sensory integration lab in which we have kids jump up and down trampolines and lie under heavy blankets and do rhythmical activities, stuff like that. And so sensory integration, we do individual yoga sessions with all of our traumatized kids in the residential treatment setting, and neurofeedback.
Thank you very much, Dr. van der Kolk.
Thank you.